Last week, members of the House of Representatives held a hearing with Google CEO Sundar Pichai in an effort to determine whether the tech giant search engine contained any sort of political bias. Conservative lawmakers are convinced that the engineers over at Google have an anti-right-wing slant because, well, let's face it, they just don't know how the internet works. That became abundantly clear to me after watching this hilarious exchange between Pichai and Republican Representative Steve Chabot.
A while back, Republicans in the House passed legislation to repeal and replace Obamacare. Our bill was called the American Health Care Act, or the AHCA. When I was writing my blog about that, I Googled American Health Care Act, and virtually every article was an attack on our bill. Article after article alleging that our bill would result in millions and millions of people losing the great care that they were supposedly getting under Obamacare. I would argue that was completely false, but it wasn't until you got to the third or fourth page of search results before you found anything remotely positive about our bill. Now, I know Google's attitude, the algorithm made us do it, but I don't know that I buy that.
Oh, you don't know if you buy that? I mean, what does that even mean? Can Representative Chabot even explain how an algorithm works? The algorithm made us do it. The most telling part of that was how shocked he was to find out that efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act have been unpopular. I'm gonna take a wild guess and assume that Americans don't like the thought of getting rid of a law that prevents private insurers from dropping them over a pre-existing condition. Of course, I could be wrong, but the great news is that we're about to find out how the public really feels about the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, because it appears that Republicans got what they've been asking for since the passage of the healthcare law. A federal judge in Texas has struck down the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, by deeming it unconstitutional following the repeal of the federal mandate by congressional Republicans.
It has been nearly 1 year since President Trump signed into law the tax cut bill passed with 0 Democratic votes in Congress. And now, one part of the legislation is impacting the future of the Affordable Care Act. The law eliminated the individual mandate, a penalty considered a tax by the Supreme Court for anyone who does not have health insurance. In a lawsuit backed by 19 Republican attorneys general and 1 Republican governor, argues that since the penalty has been eliminated, Obamacare is no longer constitutional. In a 55-page ruling, Judge Reed O'Connor agreed, writing the penalty can no longer be fairly read as an exercise of Congress's tax power.
In other words, US District Judge Reed O'Connor believes that even though the Affordable Care Act has stood up against countless legislative and legal challenges and has actually been upheld by the Supreme Court not once but twice, repealing the mandate supposedly changes the law into something new altogether. That opens the door to his interpretation that the law in its current form is unconstitutional. The Obamacare mandate, which required every American to buy health insurance, was repealed in unpopular legislation that provided massive tax cuts for the wealthy. You know, it's actually impressive how congressional Republicans can dismantle healthcare for middle class and working class Americans while simultaneously cutting taxes for their rich buddies. Maybe their party should be rebranded to the party of insult to injury. Oh, and by the way, Representative Chabot, the guy who needs a 3.5-hour-long hearing with the Google CEO to find out that his policies suck, was also shocked to find out that the tax cuts weren't received well either.
Was passed about a year ago, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, same story. Article after article attacking the Republican tax cut plan, alleging the tax cuts only went to the rich.
If Representative Chabot spent less time kissing up to donors and lobbyists, maybe he'd be aware of how Americans really feel about these issues. Anyway, let's get back to healthcare. To be fair, the federal mandate was unpopular because it essentially forced us to buy private insurance, or we'd face penalties later for not doing so. People don't like to be forced to do anything, but the whole point of the mandate was to keep healthcare premiums and deductibles low by having healthy people pay into the system to subsidize older and unfortunately oftentimes sometimes sicker patients. When Republicans repealed that portion of the healthcare law, we all suspected that it would lead to rising premiums and healthcare costs. But most people didn't expect that getting rid of the mandate would convince a federal judge that the entire law is unconstitutional. If this ruling stands, there's actually a pretty big price to pay. Although the ACA did have major flaws, it also accomplished incredibly important protections and reforms that I feel Trump supporters have taken for granted. Aside from barring insurers from denying or dropping coverage over pre-existing conditions, Obamacare also capped out-of-pocket medical expenses, something that I actually wasn't aware of myself until my husband underwent surgery this year. Now, the surgery alone, not including anesthesia, cost $40,000, but my out-of-pocket expenses were capped at a much lower number thanks to Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act also allowed kids to remain on their parents' insurance until the age of 26 and expanded Medicaid to help cover low-income Americans. Now all of that is in jeopardy. Chip Kahn, the head of the Federation of American Hospitals, says, quote, "The judge got it wrong. This ruling would have a devastating impact on the patients we serve and the nation's healthcare system as a whole." California Attorney General Javier Becerra called the ruling, quote, "an assault on 133 million Americans with pre-existing conditions." He, along with congressional Democrats, plan on challenging the Texas judge's ruling. Their hope is that our extremely conservative Supreme Court will uphold the Affordable Care Act. I guess we'll see what happens, but I personally wouldn't bet that our conservative justices, two of whom were nominated by Trump, would decide against the lower court's ruling. But again, we'll see. I guess the silver lining here is that Republicans like Steve Chabot will get a chance to measure the popularity of their policies, or lack thereof. My guess is that they're in for a lot of disappointment. In fact, researchers from Columbia University and UC Santa Barbara published a paper in the American Political Science Review demonstrating that senior congressional staffers, meaning those who are responsible for setting the legislative agenda, tend to believe that voters support conservative policies more than they actually do. According to the Washington Post, this stunning misperception can largely be explained by the disproportionate attention lawmakers and their aides lavish on donors and special interest groups. Now, for the study, the political researchers sent out a survey for senior staffers to fill out. One section of the survey asked staffers to estimate public support in their own districts for repealing Obamacare. As the Washington Post notes, the authors compared the aides' responses to actual district-level public opinion on the issues, and the results showed a stark disconnect. Aides' estimate of public support for the proposals were way off base relative to what the actual numbers indicate. And as the researchers write, in none of the 5 areas are staffers estimating their constituents' preferences with any degree of relative or absolute accuracy. Legislative aides in Republican offices were particularly bad at estimating their constituent support for various policies, including the repeal of Obamacare. So it appears that Republicans are in a bit of trouble following the federal judge's ruling on the ACA. And guess what? I'm not the only one saying it. Even conservatives are panicking over the political ramifications of this decision, and they should be. The Washington Times, which is a conservative outlet, published a headline reading, "Obamacare ruling poses new problems for the GOP." The article even continues to say that the federal judge's ruling has landed like a stink bomb among Republicans who have seen the politics of healthcare flip as Americans increasingly value the overhaul's core parts, including protections for pre-existing medical conditions and Medicaid for low-income people. Actions have consequences, and no one's immune from paying the price for being a greedy and corrupt jackass. If our lawmakers spent more time talking to their constituents and less time trying to raise money from corporate interests, maybe they'd understand the pain and suffering their policies have caused. But maybe our lawmakers want to avoid feeling uncomfortable, like how outgoing New Jersey Representative Tom MacArthur felt when one of his constituents addressed healthcare at a town hall in 2017.
My wife was diagnosed with cancer when she was 40 years old. She beat it, but every day, she lives with it. She thinks about it. Every pain, Every new something going on somewhere, is it coming back? Is this cancer? Do I have it again? Is it going to kill me this time? Is it going to take me away from my children? Speaking of which, my children both have pre-existing conditions from birth. One cardiac, one thyroid. You have been the single greatest threat to my family in the entire world. You are the reason I stay up at night. You are the reason that I can't sleep.
That was powerful. Representative MacArthur was defeated by Democrat Andy Kim in the midterm elections, and it could be a sign of more things to come for the Republican Party. Oh, you know you want to see more videos like this. Just subscribe to the channel below. And don't forget to become a TYT member and download the TYT Plus app on your phone. Head over to tyt.com/join today.